Belief systems have been with us since the start of civilization. And for just as long religion has been a source of immeasurable joy and challenges, corrupt leaders, blind persecution, the stories are as old as history and affect people around the world from all walks of life. And yet, through the cycles of fear, destruction, and imbalance, faith prevails in whatever form it takes. You might be wondering what this episode is all about. It is another episode from our shocking events that made history, and today we're going to focus on shocking events in religion and social movement, and we will start with religion. This is your host Danny, and this is another episode from Shocking Events That Made History series. Before we start, let me remind you that you can find the transcript of this episode on my website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. The link is in the show notes. And while you're on the website, take some time to explore the website and find the many learning and entertaining opportunities, especially with my new video series, which will let you enjoy a great story and learn a lot of English. And there are a lot of other things you can check out, like the English Plus Bites, the daily short reads, the audio series, and as I said, the video series, the books, the online courses, and a lot more. Just take some time and explore the site after you finish with the transcript of this episode. And while most of the content on the website is for free, some of the content is for patrons only. So if you want to unlock all the content on the website, become a patron on Patreon. In this way, you will be supporting me, helping the show go on, and at the same time, you will have great benefits. Go check out the benefits you get when you become a patron on Patreon. The link is also in the show notes. And now, without further ado, let's start with our new episode from Shocking Events That Made History series. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back, and first we're going to talk about some warring popes. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. On November the 26th, 1095, Pope Urban II issued his famous war cry, "God wills it," thus launching the first of 7 major crusades and an endless series of historically bad days against Muslims in the Holy Land. 5.5 centuries later, the Vatican was still beating the war drum, only this time, Christians were being urged to kill Christians in the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Despite being in the midst of the Enlightenment, Pope Innocent X, like his predecessor from the Dark Ages, considered the war God's work. He was thus displeased when the Treaty of Westphalia restored relative harmony to the devastated continent. Indeed, the Vicar of Christ was so unhappy with the accord compromising his own interests that on November the 26th, 1648, exactly 553 years after Urban II's call to slaughter, he issued a blistering condemnation of the treaty. It was, he declared, and I quote from his own words, "null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time." Now, all these big words he used to condemn a peace treaty. Imagine. Now, of course, that was way back in the time, but that was shocking, people. But mercifully, his tirade was ignored. Thankfully, it was ignored. So that was our first shocking event for today's episode, but we have a lot of other shocking events, so don't go anywhere. Next, we're going to talk about another shocking event that is an ancient ritual called sati in India, and thankfully it stopped happening from the time of Gandhi. But time of Gandhi, that's not a long time ago. Up till then, it was happening. That's what we're going to talk about next. It's definitely one of the most shocking events you will ever hear about, so don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Maharani Rajeshwari Devi was one powerful woman serving not only as Nepal's queen consort but as regent for her young son as well. But then her husband died. 10 days later, on May the 5th, 1806, she joined him. Though not by choice. At a time when women around the world were egregiously undervalued, widows in Nepal and India had it even worse. In an ancient ritual called sati, a woman would be bound to her husband's funeral pyre and put to rest with him. Over the centuries, hundreds of thousands of women met their demise this way, some voluntarily, with the meager compensation of being posthumously honored and declared holy martyrs. Finally, in 1931, Mahatma Gandhi spoke out after a sati incident, remarking that perhaps husbands should prove their devotion to their wives in the same way. Due to the lack of reciprocity, he went on to declare that sati had its origin in superstitions, ignorance, and blind egotism of man. And thankfully, this ancient tradition faded and it is not being followed anymore. But it is another shocking event that made history, and that has to do with religion. But here, I just want to tell you one thing. When I'm talking about religion, I'm not attacking any specific religion. I'm talking about those shocking things that technically all religions had. And while I might not have time to talk about all the outrageous things all religions did, and I will talk about some of them, please don't take that as I'm like taking sides, talking about this religion and not that religion. I just chose the shocking events randomly, so please don't be offended. We're just talking about things that I think we all agree were outrageous. And it doesn't matter which religion did what. We're just talking about the outrageous things that were being done in the name of God and in the name of religion. No matter what religion that may be, with all my respect to all religions, but these practices were outrageous. Were shocking enough to save a spot in our series, Shocking Events That Made History. And next, we're going to talk about the anti-Reformation atrocities. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. King Francis I of France considered burning at the stake too light a punishment for some heretics. He was incensed when a band of Protestants posted notices all over Paris mocking the doctrine that Christ is actually present in the Eucharist. Francis offered a large reward for the perpetrators' names, and several reputed heretics were rounded up in the affair of the Placard. On January the 21st, 1535, the king and his caravan of high-ranking ecclesiastics proceeded through Paris's streets to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, carrying the Eucharist and other sacred relics. After an expiatory mass, the king dined while outside 6 of the accused were suspended over a roaring fire and dipped into the flames to prolong their suffering. There were so many subsequent burnings that even the anti-Reformation Pope, Paul III, ordered Francis I to desist from such cruelty. It was hardly befitting a Christian king. And so it was another shocking event in today's episode, and the next shocking event, we're gonna talk about the Dreyfus Affair. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. It was just one episode in the prolonged saga of miscarried justice and virulent anti-Semitism that was known as the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus, who was an artillery captain of Jewish descent attached to the French General Staff, had already been secretly court-martialed and convicted of treason based on manufactured evidence. Then, on January 5, 1895, he was marched into the center of the École Militaire courtyard and humiliated before stands of distinguished guests. And here I quote his words. He said, "Soldiers, I am innocent. I swear that I am innocent. I remain worthy of serving in the army. Long live France." That's what Dreyfus called to his comrades. Ignoring his protests, the guards stripped Dreyfus's uniform of its buttons, braids, and epaulettes, then broke his saber. The ceremony ended with a parade of shame in which Dreyfus was forced to walk before a howling crowd. After 5 years imprisoned on Devil's Island and many more years struggling to rehabilitate his good name, Dreyfus was officially exonerated. The military that framed him, however, was never quite reconciled to its own dishonor. So that was another shocking event that happened in the name of religion, or because of religion. And next, we're gonna talk about a very specific version of the Bible that is called the Wicked Bible. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Readers of a 1631 edition of the Protestant King James Bible were shocked, or maybe pleasantly surprised, when they came across the seventh commandment in the book of Exodus that says, and here I say it exactly like it was written in that specific edition of the Bible. Of course, in the Bible, there's no such thing. But in that edition, it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." But that was not everything. Then there was the apparent blasphemy found in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Instead of "the Lord has showed us his glory and his greatness," the last word was turned into "great ass." I'm sorry, that was what the Wicked Bible said. And of course, it was a typo, it was a misprint. But that had some great repercussions, which I will talk about right now. The 1631 version inscribed with these egregious errors became known as the Wicked Bible or the Adulterous Bible. On May the 8th, 1632, the printers were hauled before the fearsome Star Chamber for their mistakes, with the additional charge of printing the Bible on bad paper. And here's what the Archbishop of Canterbury said. He said, "I knew the time when great care was had about printing. Good compositors and the best correctors were gotten. But now the paper is not, the composer's boys, and the correctors unlearned." End quote. Now, the printers were heavily fined and banned from their profession. Meanwhile, history has no record of how many marital beds may have been violated with blessings from the Wicked Bible. And that was definitely very shocking. That was another shocking event in today's episode, shocking events that made history. But that's not everything. Next, we're going to talk about something that is really shocking. Maybe one of the most shocking events in this series. We're going to talk about the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches. If you haven't heard of it before, be prepared, because this one is definitely one of the cruelest things that happened in history. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. German churchman Heinrich Kramer was having a devil of a time. Central Europe was teeming with witches who were wreaking havoc in a number of regions. Worse, local ecclesiastical authorities actively resisted his effort to confront such evil. So, like the dutiful inquisitor he was, Kramer appealed to the Pope for help. On December the 5th, 1484, His Holiness Innocent VIII obliged his loyal witch hunter by issuing the papal bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus, later known as the Witch Bull. The Pope's message acknowledged the existence of these malevolent creatures who, at the instigation of the enemy of mankind, do not shrink from committing and perpetrating the foulest abominations and filthiest excesses. Now, of course, here I'm quoting what was written in the book, not my opinion or not what I think, of course. But that was not everything. The Pope even warned local bishops not to interfere with Kramer's holy missions, or if they do that, they would risk excommunication, suspension, interdict, and still other more terrible sentences, censures, and penalties. That was all in the Witch Bull. Now, the fanatical inquisitor Kramer, whom historian Edward Peters described as a furious misogynist, was thrilled with the Pope's sanction and immediately set about compiling a handy guide to identifying, torturing, and killing the mostly female servants of Satan. The practical Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches, published in 1487. It was filled with such insightful declarations as all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. And here, of course, I'm just quoting what was written in the book. Unfortunately, these words were written somewhere in a book. And unfortunately, it was sanctioned by the Pope back then. But anyway, this might be one of the worst books ever written. And here, I'm not talking about the quality of writing. I'm talking about the content. The instructions for prosecuting a witch explain that women who did not cry during their trial should be assumed guilty. The advent of the printing press combined with religious turmoil made Malleus Maleficarum a massive bestseller and the authoritative source upon which many a judge based his ruling in ensuing periods of hysteria. Faithfully reproduced in each copy of this blood-soaked book was Pope's Innocents Witch Bull and its endorsement of our beloved son Kramer. 2 centuries later, the witch craze swept to America and reached a violent crescendo in 1692. 20 people were sent to the gallows in Salem, Massachusetts, and at least 150 more settlers accused of practicing witchcraft were sent to prison. Young girls who exhibited such symptoms as screaming and physical contortions named the alleged witches as the cause of their pain, and a special court heard the cases. Within months, the governor had disbanded the court, and the Superior Court of Judicature that took its place rejected the invisible evidence on which the former trials were predicated. Sorcery's spell was breaking in the New World, though it was far from the end of fanatical outbursts on any continent. Unfortunately, that book alone and Kramer himself were the cause of the vicious murder of thousands of women, if not even millions. Some even claim that he killed millions of women. Now, to my knowledge, that was the worst misogynist ever. And I can't even call him a man because that is not even the work of an animal. But anyway, let me not just get carried away with emotions because that was definitely shocking. But that shocking event definitely made history. And the next event is also shocking, but this time it's not against women, it is against art. We're gonna talk about Italy's Bonfire of the Vanities. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. On February the 7th, 1497, all the fun to be had in Florence went up in flames in a spectacle known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. In an effort to get the city-state of its sinful preoccupation with luxury, beauty, and entertainment, the fanatical Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who effectively ruled the Republic after the Medici were temporarily driven out, coerced Florentines to submit their most precious objects to a massive pyre erected at the Piazza della Signora. Heaped onto the structure were irreplaceable paintings, including works by Botticelli by some reports, books by Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio, sumptuous clothing, tapestries, musical instruments, and thousands of other beloved material possessions. Everything burned as the monks' followers celebrated the religious cleansing, dancing around the massive fire. It was iconic then that a little over a year later, the Pope condemned Savonarola as a heretic and consigned him to the flames at the same public square. Soon enough, the storied site would be under the watchful eye of Michelangelo's very nude, or, as the monk no doubt would have viewed it, very lewd, statue of David. So that is another shocking event that made history in the name of religion. And next, we're going to talk about the Taliban's Buddha butchers. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Maya temples bulldozed for road fill in Belize, ancient mummies violated by thieves in Egypt, the instances of cultural desecration in modern times seem to belie the very concept of civilization. Yet the violence shows no sign of abating. An especially ambitious assault ushered in the new millennium on March 2, 2001, when the Taliban regime began the project of leveling 2 ancient treasures, the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Carved into the mountainside near a former Buddhist pilgrimage site, the statues, nearly 175 and 125 feet high respectively, had stood for at least 15 centuries. The Taliban destroyed what they called the gods of the infidels within weeks. The attack began with anti-craft guns and artillery, but the Buddhas wouldn't budge. Taliban leaders publicly lamented the hard work of destruction. Finally, strategically placed explosive completed the ruin, leaving 2 tragic voids that you can see today, and you can lament the loss of 2 irreplaceable statues of Buddha. And with that, we come to the end of the first part of the episode. where we focused on events or shocking events that are related to religion. And next, we're going to move on and talk about shocking events that are related to social movement. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Even some of the most basic rights were hard-won at some point, like freedom of speech, women's suffrage, representative government, and criminal justice. Change can take decades or even centuries, as with racial equality, or it can happen in a flash, like a presidential impeachment. The historic faux pas and fiascos are products of societies that are complicated, often contradictory, and yet magnificently intertwined. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start talking about shocking events related to social movements, and our very first shocking event is the reason behind the Reign of Terror. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, of course, the Reign of Terror is related to the famous French Revolution. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, the new government launched a violent retribution known as the Reign of Terror against those it perceived as enemies. Thousands were sent to the guillotine, including God. France's new deity was reason, as revolutionary leader Joseph Fouché decreed on October the 10th, 1973. And the only acceptable worship would be that of universal morality. Fouché even ordered the supreme being out of graveyards, with the Christian promise of resurrection replaced at their entrances with the atheistic message, death is an eternal sleep. Then, after desecrating the Cathedral of Notre Dame and transforming it, along with other former places of worship, into a temple of reason, Fouché headed to Lyon. The people of France's second largest city had been slow to accept the new order of things and actually had the audacity to rebel. Fouché was determined to guide them back to reason. He started by parading the local bishop on a donkey dressed in the cleric's vestments and mitre, with a chalice around its neck and a missal tied to its tail. Then he got down to the real business of reprisals, a task he pursued with all the zeal of the truly enlightened. "Let us strike like lightning," Fouché proclaimed, "and let the very ashes of our enemies disappear with the approach of freedom." Kind of controversial. You're talking about the ashes of your enemy and freedom and stuff, so it's your freedom, not theirs. Well, we still have that problem until this very day. I mean, when people start talking about freedom, well, they're talking about their own freedom. They're not talking about your freedom. You might be free to say that what they're talking about is not freedom, but you can't, because their freedom dictates that you accept what they think is free as free. But let me not get too philosophical here. Let me continue what Fouché did, and it was really shocking. I mean, until this point, he had done a lot of shocking things, but what he did to Lyon was even more shocking. Men and women of the rebellious southern capital were lined up by the hundreds and blasted with grape shot, which was, as historian David Andrus wrote, a grotesquely ineffective means of execution. The rebels fell but didn't all die, resulting in heaps of mutilated, screaming, half-dead victims who had to be finished off with sabers and musket fire by soldiers physically sickened by the task. The spilled blood and gore made a mess in the streets of Lyon, a problem Fouché addressed reasonably by moving the mass murders outside the city. Despite these pesky inconveniences, the butcher of Lyon, as Fouché came to be called, was delighted by the progress being made in the noble cause of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And this is from what Fouché wrote. "Terror, salutary terror, is here in truth the order of the day. It represses all the efforts of the wicked. It divests crime of all covering and tinsel. We are causing much impure blood to flow, but it is our duty to do so. It is for humanity's sake. Oh dear. Again, for humanity's sake, for God's sake, for some cause's sake, we can kill." That was not exactly Fouché's invention. I mean, that is humanity's invention. But anyway, Fouché's sense of justice shifted with the political winds, and when the regime took a more moderate stance on enforcement, he did too. He alternately colluded with and plotted against Robespierre and later Napoleon. But when he tried to cozy up with Louis XVIII, pro-royalists called his bluff and he spent the rest of his life in self-imposed exile. So that was the reason behind the Reign of Terror. That's not everything. We're going to talk next about President Adams against free speech. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. On July the 14th, 1798, less than a decade after signing what became known as the Bill of Rights, President John Adams affirmed another document with quite the opposite effect of freedom, the Sedition Act, one of a series of highly restrictive laws passed that year purportedly as a wartime measure. Among its odious provisions, described by Thomas Jefferson as being palpably in the teeth of the Constitution, the act made it illegal to write, print, utter, or publish, or cause it to be done, or assist in it, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government of the United States or other House of Congress or the President with intent to defame or bring either into contempt or disrepute. And here I'm quoting exactly what was in the Sedition Act. And that's how a colorful congressman, Matthew Lyon of Vermont, ended up in prison, having boldly accused the Adams administration of ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Partisan writer James Callender, in a particularly virulent tract, The Prospect Before Us, called Adams a repulsive pedant and a gross hypocrite. A hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force of firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman, who, and here again I'm continuing the same quote, in his private life is one of the most egregious fools upon the continent, end quote. Given that John Adams had signed the Sedition Act, it could be argued that James Callender was seeking to test the president's resolve. He found himself convicted, fined, and jailed. The Sedition Act even caught in its net Benjamin Franklin Bash, who was Ben Franklin's grandson, editor and publisher of the General Advertiser. Targeted by Federalists, he was arrested on June the 26, 1798, for libeling the president. All in all, 14 journalists were tried, some of whom were imprisoned under the act. The Sedition Act, as Adams' biographer David McCullough noted, has been rightly judged by history as the most reprehensible of the administration's actions. When Thomas Jefferson became president in 1800, the Sedition Act was allowed to expire, and the First Amendment returned to the citizenry the right to partake in free, even unflattering speech. And next, we're going to talk about a shocking event against literature. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Some of literature's greatest classics were once considered provocative or inflammatory and were banned in American communities. These stoled masterworks included The Great Gatsby, The Catcher in the Rye, and The Grapes of Wrath. The U.S. Postmaster General Arthur E. Summerfield took it upon himself to ban another famous book, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, from the mail system. His indignant justification, rendered on June the 11th, 1959, and here I quote, "The book is replete with descriptions in minute detail of sexual acts. These descriptions utilize filthy, offensive, and degrading words and terms. Any literary merit the book may have is far outweighed by the pornographic and smutty passages." End quote. A federal judge later overturned the decision and, as a final sting, added that the Postmaster General was unqualified to render such a judgment. So that was about stamping out a classic. And next, we're going to talk about the Unabomber's self-destructs. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, a mysterious killer known as the Unabomber had wantonly murdered 3 people and injured scores more with explosive he had planted or mailed in his quest to subvert modernism. The FBI had searched intensively, but it had yet to identify the terrorist when he contacted the New York Times and the Washington Post and declared that he would cease his bloody campaign if his 35,000-word manifesto was published. After much debate, the Post agreed to run the rambling tirade on September the 22nd, 1995. One reader recognized the unique writing style as belonging to Theodore or Ted Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor who lived as a recluse in a remote cabin in Montana. That reader was the Unabomber's brother, whose tip to the FBI finally resulted in Kaczynski's arrest. And with this shocking event, we come to the end of today's episode. And next time, we're going to continue on talking about shocking events that have to do with social movement. So stay tuned for a new episode of Shocking Events That Made History next week. But don't forget, we have other series running alongside Shocking Events That Made History. We have our Great Mystery series. We have our Word Power series. We have an Essential Guide to Your Body and Brain series. And very soon, or actually not very soon, I'm going to tell you next week, actually, we're going to have the Phoenix Fiction series. I'm going to tell you any more about it. I'll be talking more about it later on. It's not a secret, but I'm still putting my final touches on it, so I want to tell you about the thing you're going to actually hear next week. But anyway, that'll be the end of today's episode. Don't forget that you can find the transcript of this episode on the website. The link is in the show notes, and while on the website, go ahead and explore the website. You will find a lot of things. And some of the things that are locked, some of the valuable things actually, you can unlock them by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can pledge any amount of money per month, and there is no obligation. You can cancel your pledge anytime you want. But when you become a patron, of course, you will be supporting me as a content creator, supporting this podcast to continue, and you will get a lot of exclusive content and benefits. So consider it. There's also a link in the description that will take you to my Patreon page. So how about going there, check out the benefits you get, and then you can decide whether you want to support this channel. So that'll be all for today. This is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening to another episode from our series, Shocking Events That Made History, and from our podcast, English Plus Podcast. I will see you next time.